Hello, and welcome to the Director's Seminar at the Warburg Institute. I'm Bill Sherman, and I'm actually coming at you from the home of the original Warburg Institute, which is Hamburg, Germany. And I'm in a hotel room, which I hope you won't look at too closely. And I am really thrilled to introduce not just one, but two of the most imaginative writers working today, both of whom have shown, I think, why we sometimes need fiction and sometimes need the performing arts to do justice to history. They're known for work in very, very different areas. Rivka, for instance, has recently written an essay for the New Yorker that I hope you all read that made NASA's new telescope as beautiful as a Botticelli. And my old friend Ulinka has given all kinds of new rigor and flair to the history of Renaissance fashion. But they've come together around a single figure who was of great interest to A.B. Warburg, our founder, Johannes Kepler. And in addressing the witch trial of Kepler's mother, they have shed new light on the relationship between science, magic, and religious belief that has always been one of the core questions or problems of the Warburg Institute. So I'm really grateful to have them here, but the best person to work at that interface of science, magic, and religious belief is, of course, our very own professor of art, science, and folk practice, John Tresch. So John, I'm going to hand over to you and let you moderate tonight's event. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bill. And I'm going to remove your spotlight for a bit of dramaturgy. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us. I want to give a really warm welcome to Ulinka and Rivka for joining us. Just to add to what Bill said, Rivka Galchen is, this is her, we're here to talk primarily about Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch. Her recent book published this summer. This is her second novel. Her first, Atmospheric Disturbances, was extremely well received, but she's also written in the meantime a short story collection, American Innovations, an essay, Little Labors, and even a children's book, Rat Rule 79. She's had many fellowships and awards, and as Bill pointed out, is a regular contributor of essays, reviews, and fiction to many periodicals. And she teaches at Columbia and lives in New York, and sometimes I hear in Montreal. Our other speaker we're just as happy to have here is Ulinka Rublack, whose book, The Astronomer and the Witch, was one of the inspirations for Rivka's novel. And Ulinka is the editor of the Oxford Handbook of the Protestant Reformations, has written many books, including Dürer in the Age of Wonder, as well as this fantastic book on Johannes Kepler and his fight for his mother. That book and others of hers won her the Deutsche Historiker Prize, only given once every 3 years. And she's currently at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, the Knowledge College, working on her next project, The Triumph of Fashion, which charts the rise of fashion in different parts of the globe from 1300 onwards. So when I read Rivka's book, I thought, this is amazing. This is contemporary fiction that's speaking directly to the kinds of things that we do here, that we mine in the archives at the Warburg Institute. And immediately it was obvious that we should have her come speak, and there was no one better to converse with her than Ulinka. So what we want to do tonight is proceed with 3 acts. The first will be Rivka just giving a brief informal overview of the book, and even she's agreed to give a little reading of a small passage, just to give those who haven't read it a sense of the texture and really the unique style of the book. Then she and Ulinka will have a conversation, but given how many people here and how many people there are here, and so many of them that we want to hear from, we're going to open it up for discussion from the audience for the last 20 minutes or so. So that's how we're going to proceed. And Rivka, if you're ready, I'm going to hand the spotlight over to you. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Ulinka, for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here, and I'm going to apologize. This is like classic for Zoom for all the sounds of construction in the neighborhood, and hopefully it won't be too distracting. I really feel like this book was written I don't want to sort of put the burden on her, but I feel like this book was sort of generated by Ulinka. I was spending a lot of time reading basically the biographies of scientists. I feel like many people dealt with the sort of difficulties of the past 5 years, or the kind of loudness of history, or the contemporary moment in different ways. And for me, I didn't really want to read the news. I wanted to read something that felt longer and more profoundly thoughtful, because I felt like I'd sort of run out of the ability to sort of learn from the onslaught of the news. And I was reading a lot of scientific biography, and I was looking to learn more about Kepler. And I really ordered Ulinka's book because I thought maybe I'll learn more about Kepler. I wasn't really had no interest before then in his mother's witch trial, but I was absolutely kind of struck by lightning by the book. And so the basic story is that Kepler, as I imagine most people who had come to event here are aware, came from quite a humble background. And his mother, when she was, now probably was one of the oldest women in town, now that her age doesn't sound as old to us, but towards the end of her life, kind of in an almost Oscar Wildean way, although you can debate that, stumbled into this witch trial. There was a sense that she was being slandered, and just sort of engaging in the accusation seemed to generate momentum. And this took almost 6 years of her life. And what I noticed when I was reading Ulinka's book, which made me want to engage with the material in the form of a novel, were three things, basically. The first was that here I was reading this story from about 400 years ago, and I was reading it with a sense of suspense, wondering if indeed Kepler's mother was a witch. And Ulinka sort of structures the book, I felt, in a way that leaves you open to that, because it comes as kind of like this big reveal when she asks a grave digger if she could, how difficult would it be to obtain her father's skull and cover it. And there's just these moments and I noticed that it seemed interesting to me and powerful and frightening in a wonderful way, that I myself, even 400 years later, an enlightened thinker, was so susceptible and kind of titillated by this accusation. So that was one aspect that really opened it up for me. The other was the absolutely seductive, charismatic idea of who this illiterate mother of a tremendous mind might have been. And that voice seemed so worth imagining. And I really connected it as one does, and in a sort of, we all get these things wrong in our own way. And I think that a novel is just kind of like your own, hopefully charismatic, incorrect take on something. And I put her in my mind with mathematicians in my own family, not as storied as these, but just one of the things that's special about Kepler is that he was quite canny and quite capable of manipulating social relationships and giving gifts to people in power, and was, had just sort of basic social and emotional skills, which isn't like the stereotype of someone with a mathematical gift. And I thought of his mother more like the people I know who are quite surprised when something being true or something being well-reasoned ends up being inconsequential or unpersuasive. And that special kind of person is someone that my whole life is a kind of character or species, a sort of subspecies of human that has held my attention. And I really thought of Kepler's mother in that way, based on the scant but at the same time substantive details that are available about her life. So those two aspects came together. And the third aspect that came together was a small detail in Ulinka's book about midway through the trial, someone who had been serving as her legal guardian steps down and asks the court to dismiss them. And we don't really know much about who that was. We don't know much about his character or his motivations. He's sort of cited being kind of old and tired, I believe. And that also popped the book open for me, because I feel a connection to this idea of being a kind of bystander of tremendous injustice. I think a lot of us have that feeling. And that was, in fact, the story of someone who is treated badly and shouldn't be treated badly is a very important story ethically, but a novel has to have more uncertainty and more movement. And so for me, a lot of that movement was a sort of how do the people around Katharina behave? And her son behaves actually quite exemplary. It pretty much behaves really well. So this figure of the neighbor was really interesting to me, and that's how it popped into a novel. So that's the orientation. I was gonna just read a tiny bit, because Zoom is maybe not like the best place for reading, but a tiny bit from The Voice of Simon. So the novel switches perspectives. So this is about 40 pages into the book. You've been listening to Katharina's tale, which is being written down by her neighbor. And he decides it's time for him to say a few words. He says, since the glazier and his wife have succeeded in reversing Katharina's civil case against them into a criminal case against her, I thought it would be clarifying if I, Simon, explained myself here. I stepped in as Katharina's legal guardian after Christoph's intemperate first performance. That's her son. That was more than 3 years ago, almost 4. I'm an old man and ill-suited to the position. And to think that I had expected everything to be resolved within a season or 2 at most. Certainly I hadn't expected the situation to escalate as it has. I will stand by Katharina nonetheless, as to stand by is fundamental to my character. However, calumny has a broad shadow. And since I am a friend to Katharina, I think it's fair to use that term. That shadow has reached my doorstep, though hopefully it has not made its way into my home. If someone were to interrogate me as to my motives or knowledge, I would like to be prepared. Let me start with how I first came to be acquainted with Katharina. I try my best to like people, to expect good from them. If you see someone as a monster, it is as good as attaching a real horn to them and poking them with a hot metal poker. I really do think so. In order to avoid turning people into monsters by suspecting them of being monsters, I do my best to keep myself mostly to myself. Even as I live and work here quietly in a city surrounded by people, a monk without a monastery, that was my hymn for many years. Even a monastery, too much of a crowd. Monasteries may as well be called prisons or dens of sin, I'm told. Living in Leonberg allowed me to be unseen in plain sight. Customers see me as they might see a water pitcher or a hammer or a patch of shade as a thing for a particular use. That's how I like it. A home in town is preferable to a home in the countryside for another reason. In the countryside, you have no choice but to take care of whoever is passing by. But in town, there's always another house near enough to offer help. Also, here in town, I live near a church. The piety of the building extends, I like to think, beyond its walls. It can seem as if I've attended sermons, even if I don't leave my kitchen table. I'm nearly there. I'm an annex. That's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rivka. And I really want to congratulate you on, again, everybody should read this book, on an absolutely wonderful achievement in the imagination. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because we know so much about the community in which Katharina lived, which is so unusual for that time. So you mentioned it's a town called Leonberg in the southwest of Germany. It's about 1,000 inhabitants. And all the court records survive from that period and other records. So working with them was really a joy to try to put together a sense of, well, what was her life like when this accusation completely shatters her family's prospects in 1615. So it's summer 1615 that accusation is made that she's a witch, and Kepler learns about it sometime after, and then the trial ends only in 1621. So it's one of these cases where the family really has to live through that trauma of an accusation like this. And the way I reconstructed her biography really showed that, you know, when this accusation comes, she probably was at the best point in her life. You know, much of her life was secure. She had grown-up children who did well, and so on and so forth. But still, you know, the challenge remains despite all this evidence, which we unusually have. And that's what I want to ask you about, Rivka, is how do we find a voice for this illiterate woman? And I wonder just how you went about imagining her personality and that voice.
Yeah. You know, like you said, the part of what felt so enchanting to me about this project, which really, in the best way, I sort of felt like I didn't choose. It held my attention at every minute, and I followed it. Was, like you said, the kind of wealth of detail about minor everyday, which felt refreshing and different. And of course, like, I connected to things like the cheese and the worms and the return of Martin Guerre, things where suddenly, because of a trial and all this documentation and everyone following things, you got a record of things that normally would sort of be washed away with time. And so I just had a lot of fun reading. Actually, I'm an Ulinka completist, and also I imagine your colleague Lyndall Roper. I just had a lot of fun in the record. But in terms of the voice, I felt like I was actually like ridiculously confident in putting the voice together. I shouldn't have been, but I said to myself, I decided this is a very intelligent woman. She's illiterate, she's uneducated, but I connected her to people like that in my own life. And I actually also said to myself, I actually decided to tone down the voice, because I thought about how when you don't write and when you don't read, I actually think you become a more gifted speaker often. Not in the contemporary world, but I was thinking about the way, you know, Socrates would rail against how writing was destroying memory, and they were great mnemonists, and we sort of lost the great mnemonists. And I do sometimes think, and I know this is probably inaccurate, but I think in a certain way that conversation, and this may be an allusion of Shakespeare plays, but conversation was once at a higher level than it is today, because it doesn't need to be so high, because we have so many sort of like alternative ways of communicating. So I thought, well, what if you're like compressing all of this intelligence through like a pretty narrow gap? Like, she doesn't get to use it in all sorts of other ways. And so it comes through this other gap. So I just, you know, I had a lot of fun. I had too much confidence. I thought of her as sort of like a Leonora Carrington hearing trumpet kind of adjacent voice. And like I said before, I thought of her as one of these species of people. I do think of it that way. You know, I felt like I somehow modeled her a little bit on my own father and my own mother, who have, you know, a conviction that's almost quixotic, that because they are smart, or because they have truth on their side or reasoning on their side, that somehow this will matter to people. And it's an error. It's like a really interesting error that can be made when done extremely. And I thought, well, I think she's one of those. I think she's of that species, even though she, you know, I think, you know, we might say, okay, well, actually she's selling these magical herb packets. But I thought, well, they're not so magical. You know, just like I've never understood why alchemy is separated out as this ridiculous other pursuit that wasn't science. I think, well, it sort of felt like it obeyed a lot of the same procedures, and thought obviously it was different, but it was familiar, was a cousin to scientific thinking. And I thought of her that way as well. I thought, like, it's not maybe what we would recognize as a kind of mathematical mind, but I thought it kind of was, but in a different ecology. What happens to that kind of mind in a different ecosystem?
Yeah, and this is, I mean, just to say about alchemy, this is the great age of alchemy, where alchemy is absolutely integral to natural philosophy, where alchemists are state-sponsored, where it's absolutely crucial to notions of the new innovative body politic. But one of the real distinguishing features of the novel also is that you characterize her as a humorous woman. And I just wonder whether you want to say a little bit more about how you use humor. I mean, to me, it's also a way in which she resists authority, for instance, by name calling her opponents. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Again, like I sort of, I think I was almost too confident that I thought, well, like, of course she's going to be humorous, because humor is like a kind of agile way of relating to power. And she was a woman, and she was sort of, as you said, well established by the end of her life, but also like a woman who had faced a great deal of difficulty. And it was unusual for a woman in that town to be basically running her own finances for so many years, since she was a widow for so long. And it just seemed like she isn't an underdog, but she's also an underdog. And like every underdog, that breeds a kind of sense of humor, because I feel like it's a sort of pressure. It's like an ability to say something mildly forbidden, but not entirely forbidden. It finds its like kind of weaselly way forward. So I thought of it that way, but I also, again, thought of it a little bit in terms of math, because I thought that often the way that I think of humor as a kind of like check on truth, because if something amuses someone or makes them laugh, it's usually, that's hard to fake. And so I thought of it the way that like often like the way they build barcodes, they'll have like the last number is a confirmation of everything that came before. So it's like taking a sense of the whole structure. And I just thought, well, she has that kind of mind that is kind of like following out the pattern and then sees where it breaks, which is a kind of way of resisting, or a kind of way of having a critique, even if only an internal one, of the system around you. And I connect that pattern recognition and breaking with both a mathematical and a kind of humorous mind. But I was curious to ask you, because you sort of describe, I think, at the end of your book, like that you had wanted to do this project for a long time, and obviously it was a story that you knew about, maybe hadn't gone into the archives. And I was curious what surprised you, or like what ended up not. There must have been like a kind of a journey, or like a gap from how you entered the project and how you exited the project.
I think what I didn't know at the beginning was just how the family dynamic was important to this story, and that's what's so fascinating about this case, amongst many other facets, because you can really track how the daughter of Katharina Kepler, the youngest son, they just, and the son-in-law as well, who's married to the daughter, you know, they increasingly just can't bear the pressure of this trial and the demand that accusations makes. And therefore, you know, what fascinated me also is very much that figure of Kepler, about whom, again, you know, we know a lot, and who wrote very frankly and interestingly about himself. So how he then actually deals with the legal defense, because that stands out about the trial. It's the only case, I think, in which a relative of a woman accused of witchcraft actually takes over the legal defense, and he did that in writing. He made sure he got all the documents from the court, and he dissected the witness statements. And so my argument then turned out to be that his scientific career absolutely prepared him to write this unique defense of his mother. But that's probably, you know, a big difference really between my book, The Astronomer and the Witch, and your book, because you made a very radical decision. So my book is about the relationship between Katharina and Johannes Kepler, and how we can imagine their worlds and the worlds and of the family. And in your book, he's just called Hans.
Yeah.
And in fact, we learn more about, you might say provocatively, we learn more about Katharina's relationship to her cow then we learn about Kepler's thoughts and life. Why did you make that decision?
Yeah, one, I don't know. I never know. It's sort of like ended up that way. But I think that my instinct, or what was guiding me, was I write a lot of nonfiction, and I feel quite sensitive to what benefits from a fictional treatment and what doesn't benefit as much from a fictional treatment. And I felt that Kepler was so bright a light that in a novel he would drown out everything else. That he has a sort of cameo power. And so I feel like, there's a reason that Hitchcock only comes on for sort of a half a second and boards a train, because otherwise it's the whole book inevitably is going to sort of bend towards his gravity as it should, basically. And so I felt that part of it was just that instinct, that I felt that in the form of a novel, which functions so differently, that his gravity would be too strong. But then also I had like personal reasons I felt that way. I felt like this is her take, and I felt that I don't know why I felt this way, but I felt that she was proud of her son and loved her son, but also was the center of her own story, and on some level would diminish his role, both positive and negative. I felt that she would have some sense that he was not irrelevant to the kind of evil eye effect that I felt that she experienced, because he was so, in my mind, haunting to the town, to have a figure who would be so successful and so beyond the boundaries of the town. So that was just like a psychological reason why I thought she would diminish his role when she herself was telling the story. But again, that was really instinctive, and also just that natural fictional drive to feel that, fiction has a gift for kind of minor spaces and minor characters, and that was the realm where it would find it. That they would grow best in shade instead of under the kind of rather bright, the bright glow of his brilliance and career. And also, when I realized what a good guy he was, basically, I decided he couldn't really be at the center of the book, because it's actually very moving to me in Ulinka's book. It's a great risk to himself, really, to stand by his mother. And it did seem like he understood that it would be worth trying to keep this trial quiet from the court, and that was quite moving to me, just how well behaved he was. And it was almost like another thing that I changed from the historical record was how much they suffered, because I thought I didn't want this novel to be a kind of pornography of suffering. And so many children are lost by the family during that period of time, and I really compressed that into just one. Again, to sort of like manage the gravity of the book, where the pull was.
Well, it's very clear, however, that Kepler didn't really have a choice. I mean, when he gets a letter from his sister saying, mom has been accused of witchcraft, he's at the height of his career. I mean, that's really the drama. He thinks at that moment that God has waited for him for 500 years to explain the building plans of the world, the universe, everything. So, I mean, he's not a shy, insecure he wants to write the philosophy of everything, and in fact also comment on psychology, and enter his mother with that accusation. Of course, if you were known to be the son of a witch, and also if you weren't from a wealthy background, I mean, that would have ended his career. And I do think that if he hadn't defended her, she would have been burned as a witch, given the local circumstances. So, in many ways, he didn't have a choice but to defend her. And that's important to say. And I just want to say one thing about the notion that he's the great Kepler. I really don't think, despite his, I mean, he had intellectual self.
That they knew
but he felt, of course, incredibly precarious. So he had been accused by Orthodox Lutheran theologians as someone who was, in danger of confusing students with some of his beliefs. He never had a university position all his life. He was called imperial mathematician, but he didn't get paid very much money. He had to somehow find money to even print his own books. I mean, it is really extraordinary. And so I think his self-perception would have not been as the great Kepler in that sense. And that's important to remember. But what fascinates me really also about this case and the effect on him is that it forces him to ask that question in a different light of, how is it that we know, and that we know scientifically, and what really is who would want to define? And I think that's the link to Warburg and his interest. Who would want to define with certainty the line between magic and rationality? And that he's clever enough to see that. And when you talk to mathematicians today, what fascinates me, and I wonder whether you've had similar conversations, mathematicians work with a blank page. Their whole effort is to get to that moment of a leap, of thinking out of the box. And they all admire Kepler for having thought out of the box in coming up with the figure of the ellipse, which again fascinated Warburg. So that in Hamburg, where Bill is at the moment, of course, the library of the initial Warburg library has, its ceiling is shaped like an ellipse. So, and the fact that this is a really dynamic space in which physical forces must operate and is opposed to the harmonious figure of the circle, in which that just can't happen. I mean, that is what he's admired for. But what interests me about your book is that I almost feel that you provide some thinking towards that question of how he could come up with the ellipse. And that is that, we can see that because of his social position also, and because he experienced the world, therefore, very differently in the relationships. And these relationships really weren't easy amongst the people of Leonberg, or, for him, even as he then entered boarding schools and so on, that, the dynamic of these and their ever-changing nature might explain also what made him able to think out of the box in just that way. I mean, is that something you've thought about?
Well, I mean, I was very moved, like as you detailed, that he had such a difficult life, and I was like amused by the horoscopes that he writes for himself and his family when he's quite young, and his descriptions of himself in relation to the other boys in the school, like still kind of, like you said, despite the fact that he intellectually was like of another class, he still was sort of involved in kind of, just frustration at the status and all of those things. And again, like you said, financially precarious. I thought it was really interesting when he married a second time. The woman that he chose was relatively lower status, but had other among the 11 women that he was choosing among, that sort of the decision he made was outside of the box, or outside of these kind of perfect harmonies. And it was interesting to think of him in comparison, of course, to Tycho Brahe, who he worked with, who had enormous wealth, who took incredibly accurate data, who was kind of the master of finer kind of equipment to take the data down, but isn't the person who makes the creative, not that that's not creative, of course, it's like an enormous contribution, but I thought of Kepler, like you said, and therefore I thought of his mother that way, which may again be sort of unfair, but I sort of felt like it's a family resemblance as the person who has the capability for a more creative leap because their experience is less fixed and stable, and they're in a less fixed and stable world, and they're going in between different spaces that operate by very different rules. And again, like that was part of what was so moving about the different ways in which Kepler's life overlaps with his mother, that he writes her defense, but then you also, I thought, brought up very cannily, very late, this sort of somnium book, which like many scientific texts at that time was framed as like a dream or a vision so that it could be more acceptable and has a kind of narrative, both to, both to make it easier to follow, but also hedged in a sort of interesting way. And that it may actually have caused her trouble. It's unclear, right? It may have caused her trouble that he has this early text. And I did think that even though he maybe didn't think of himself as the great Kepler and was always sort of under pressure, I still felt that he generated envy, just as someone who had sort of, as the classic kind of the one who had left town and had sort of gone on to other positions. Because it seemed like there was room for envy, even just in terms of like who went to what school and who didn't go to what school. And it just seemed like on another level. So I agree that I thought of both of them as in different ways. And obviously with Kepler, it's actually consequential in a different way, but I thought of them as people with an imaginative capacity that exceeded most people because of the dynamic shape of their life, just the way that, if you change the shape of a violin, the sound is going to change. And that I felt that they were not, they were an unusual shaped instrument.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just to sum up, in a way, you explain exactly that there was no being in the box for someone like Kepler, and his own mother also. She was from a peasant background, and she also moved socially upward. But then she had this. Well, she's got the son who's an astronomer. I mean, so there's kind of not quite life in a box for her anymore either.